Thank you all. Garbage, what do you mean, garbage? Those of you who like recreation, so do these birds that you're going to hear about. They're all for it. The more recreation, the better, as far as they're concerned. Sometimes they do strange things. This picture or drawing is of a raven in North Cascades National Park that had a habit of ripping windshield wipers off of campers' cars when they'd come there. I have no idea why, but by trapping the bird and banding it and measuring it on a windshield, its behavior tended to be reduced. Any hints on the...
Arrow on the clicker.
Yeah? Oh, that one. We've heard some great talks about general relationships of wildlife to recreation. I just wanted to point out some of the ways that I look at it. Lots of different recreational activity can affect behavior or take animals out completely. Those can translate into population effects and community effects, and I will talk about a little bit of both of those today.
So, John,
Yeah.
walk away from the mic. The webinar people don't hear you.
How do you like that, webinar people? Probably don't like that, do you? I'll stay right here. Sorry. Corvids have been increasing around the world. Here's a few examples of that, not only here in the U.S., but elsewhere. Those increases are typically tied to urbanization, as Cheryl was saying, or also recreational activity. Here's an example that shows it in Seattle for American crows. And the idea here is that their numbers have basically increased exponentially in close association with increases in human population. And yeah, they do eat garbage in this particular case and lots of other things we won't mention. I want to talk a little bit about them in a more wildland setting. And this is going to be work from Olympic National Park and surrounding Forest Service lands there. We did studies where we radio tagged crows, ravens, Steller's jays, and also gray jays in that setting and looked at how they responded. Our best data are from these three species, so I'll focus on those. But this slide just shows that the abundance of these birds is much greater when you're near settlement for crows and ravens, not so much for Steller's jays, than when you're further away from settlement or recreation. And in this case, the recreation I'm talking about is mostly campsites. They use food there, and because of that food, they increase their reproductive output. So again, for crows and ravens, which are more abundant near human activity, their reproduction is higher there as well. Not so much for jays. And their survivorship is higher, especially for crows. The proportion of birds that survive, they're almost immortal when they're close by human activity versus when they're further away. And the reason for that is because they don't have to travel as far. What this map shows, I'm hoping there's a pointer on here. Which one's the pointer? Not that one. Not that one. I won't touch any more buttons on this.
Very top.
The very top? Oh, look at that. So what these show are nest sites for crows and ravens, and these are all ones that were far away from human activity or camping activity. And what they did is they basically beeline into places like a town of Forks, a correctional facility where there was lots of food provided, and a waste transfer station. So these long forays, the distance of these bars indicates how far they have to go, but it was not uncommon for them to go 30 kilometers to some of these point sources of food. And their home range size reflects that. So birds that, for example, crows here that nest near humans have very small home ranges relative to those that nest far away. Same thing for ravens. Again, not so much for jays. Steller's jays respond mostly to fragmentation, not so much the subsidies that are provided in campgrounds. The size of the campground matters. This is the amount of activity by crows that were radio tagged in campgrounds of different size. So larger campgrounds, birds spent more of their time in those campgrounds than they did in smaller campgrounds. Again, it's related to food. So corvids aren't the only things out there that are responding to recreation on the landscape in this sort of positive way. And we've tried to look at this by surveying a campground here on the Olympic Peninsula. The campground is in this yellow kind of panhandle shape. There are the loops for camping, some other road net shown there. And we surveyed areas beyond the camp and also in the campground and related the occurrence of different potential nest predators to that place. So here's basically a home range or a contour map of crow use of that area. It's centered right on the campground. Same thing for Steller's jays. Again, not as precise as crows, but still a lot of activity in the campground. Ravens, not so much. There was basically a use of another area here that food was provided at. But Douglas squirrels, concentrated in the campground. Chipmunks, concentrated in the campground. And together, all those different potential predators on other birds' nests are concentrated to a strong degree in the campground. So we were interested in what effect that might have on the birds that were nesting there. Most of our research was geared to trying to understand the response of these birds to marble merlets, which we simulated their nests of. I won't go into detail on that, but that's an example of a simulated marble merlet chick that a Steller's jay is having its way with. But with other songbirds that nested around there, we just either counted them or looked at their productivity. And this is just the count data. And what you see are areas that are highly used by predators. So those areas that are in that center of that contour distribution I showed you. And the abundance of robins, for example, was actually higher in those areas. For Pacific slope flycatchers, it was lower. For Wilson's warblers, it was also higher in those particular areas. Sorry, I made a mistake there. The high refers to high use by the predator, so high predation areas. So these birds were avoiding those areas, even though this says high, it's high predation, not high activity of the species here. So more robins where there were fewer predators, more Swainson's thrush, more Wilson's warblers where there were fewer predators. All right, nesting success also tended to follow that pattern. Nesting success of robins was basically higher rates of predation where there was a lot of predators. That was a strong relationship. Same for Pacific slope flycatchers. So being around these areas where these birds are concentrated can have detrimental impacts for some species, but not all of them. So for example, juncos weren't affected by that. They were actually successful. They had fewer nests preyed upon where there were not so many predators, but these birds are nesting on the ground under concealment, and they're not as exposed as a robin nest or a flycatcher nest would be to these predators. These relationships are also pretty subtle. So these are results from our merlet studies, and basically these are survivorship curves of nests over time. A 30-day period is either an egg exposure period or nestlings are in the nest for that long for merlets. And these lines are not all that different, as you can see among these different treatments. In this case, if the nests are within 50 meters of a campground or a small town, their rate of predation is indeed faster than those that are greater than 200 meters from that activity. But it was jumbled here if it was just an edge that didn't have human activity. So if you're thinking about developing a forested area by putting a campground in, what you may do to some predators is some prey, slightly increase the chances of those nests being preyed upon if they're very close to that site as opposed to a little further away from it. But they're not strikingly huge differences in this case. And in other cases, this is from Europe, but in other cases, there's no relationship between the abundance or occurrence of the predators and success of their prey. So magpies, in this case, greater magpie abundance was not associated with greater nest mortality of songbirds. And in some cases, actually, the behavior of the prey can swamp these predators as well. So this is an example from Alaska where murres were breeding, and this shows basically the number of eggs available at any point in time, and because they synchronize their laying and hatching, there's a lot of eggs available late in the season, and this is the amount of those that were preyed upon by ravens, and that declines through time or remains very low. And basically there's just too many eggs for the ravens to keep up with. They steal a lot of them and cache them for later use, but they're swamped by this behavior of the prey. So my whole point with these series of slides is to indicate that just because the predators are necessarily there in an area doesn't directly translate into a reduction in the prey that could potentially be affected. A lot of things affect nesting birds, and sometimes the birds can outsmart even or outproduce the predators in this case. What about to the ecosystem? What effects does moving these birds around on the landscape, attracting them into campgrounds and that sort of thing, what effect does that have on the ecosystem function? For example, there were concerns with Clark's nutcrackers, which are another corvid. There was concerns that they would not be dispersing white bark pine if they're sitting around road pull-offs waiting for handouts all the time. So we studied this a bit in Rainier National Park, and we did that by basically putting out points to count birds out over much of the developed parts of the park, some quite remote, some right in campgrounds, some of intermediate abundance. And I just want to run through this slide is basically going to reiterate one point over and over for you. So these are factors in our investigation, our models, that were significantly related in this case to the occupancy of an area by Steller's jays. And I just point to the recreation and the food availability. These were sites that either had a picnic table or had some sort of food available versus were more backcountry camping sites that really didn't have any developed, consistent food available. And available food increased the occupancy by Steller's jays. The closer they were to a campground, the average number of visitors using that area, and the zone is a type of, was it a trail, was it a backcountry site, etc. All those aspects of recreation influence Steller's jay occupancy. Similarly, gray jay occupancy, same sorts of variables were important. Likewise, ravens, except with ravens, one important thing that you've mentioned in several of the previous talks is roads. And if you want to increase ravens in an area, just put more roads in. They love roads. They hunt them every morning looking for roadkill, and that's a prime predictor of their occupancy of an area. But again, they're responding to food. Likewise, Clark's nutcrackers. They do shift their activities. They always stay close to white bark pine, but they do come into areas where food's available if it's also close. We did not find significant changes in their use of the landscape with respect to moving away from white bark pine into campgrounds, but there was a slight effect there. So in all four of these species in fairly remote areas, they're responding to the presence of food at recreation sites consistently. So what do we do about that? It's pretty simple. Don't have food out there. That would solve a lot of this issue. But I know that's harder to do than it is to say. So there's a variety of things individuals can do. You can, again, there's lots of campaigns to basically not feed the wildlife, keep your camp clean. But it's pretty hard to enforce that, and it's pretty hard to even not do that when you're sitting there and these interesting birds are coming up to you and kind of looking at you like they're begging, and people will throw them a chip or a piece of bread. But even bird feeders around the extent of recreational sites can influence these birds. Pet food and livestock food, we saw lots of small hobby farms around the Forest Service land on the peninsula that influenced our birds dramatically. Those were some of those point sources that they would fly a long ways to. During hunting and fishing, having ideas about how to handle gut piles and offal can be an important way to reduce these. And even if they are a problem in some areas, it's not out of the realm to harass them basically and keep them out of particular areas. They respond very quickly and strongly to that sort of punishment, like that raven I started the talk with. For managers at kind of the local scale, again, trying to keep a more balanced predator community can be helpful. Removing nesting opportunities. A lot of these birds, crows and ravens, will nest on anthropogenic structures. So if those are in the area, they will use those. Even Steller's jays, I remember one nesting on a Forest Service bunkhouse on the Olympic Peninsula under the eaves of the house. So again, removing food, removing nesting opportunities. Managing the prey to be able to swamp them in times like the murs were able to do, so keeping colonies large and that sort of thing can help a lot with respect to how these typical prey respond to this natural predator. Aversively conditioning, even lethal control in extreme cases can be used and is used. But I think the bottom line with these birds is that it's much better to teach them to stay out of an area or to not use a particular area than it is to kill them. These are long-lived animals, 20, 30 years. And if you teach them, for example, like that raven, to not pull windshield wipers off of cars, they will stay territorial there. They will not do the behavior you don't want them to do, and they'll keep others out from coming in and having to be taught again and again. And then at the landscape scale, some of these birds, Steller's jays in particular, really respond to edge. And so reducing that patchiness on the landscape certainly is going to help reduce their abundance there. But of course that has negative connotations for other species that need heterogeneous landscapes. Again, just removing food, but we're talking fairly large distances here. 30 kilometers. When some of the maps earlier struck me in that I did a plot one time of that radius around point sources in Yellowstone. The entire park was covered basically by that radius. So that's a scale that you're working with here. It's a large scale for something like a raven. They will travel far for food. These other sorts of things are again at trying to reduce nest sites and food, all kinds of subsidies that we're providing for them. So to coexist with these animals, we basically need very specific information. Different individuals, different species are responding differently. Here, it could certainly be well suited for experiments to see how, for example, closure of a campground could affect these animals. We had that happen to one of our campsites in Olympic Park, and the abundance of corvids dropped in half in 1 year of that site being closed. And we could benefit a lot, again, as we've heard earlier today, by engaging more with the recreationists that are using the area as well. So I would just end with a different perspective. We've had a couple of new projects going on in Denali National Park, and there the corvid scene is quite different. There are magpies, gray jays, and common ravens there, but there's virtually no food out in the park from human activity. There are no places where you can buy food in the park once you leave the headquarters area. Most people go in and out by a bus. Those of you who have been there have seen that. When you're hiking, you're pretty much worried about grizzly bears, so any food you have is well protected and concealed. And you don't see the abundance of these birds around human use sites like you do in Yellowstone or Rainier or Olympic. So reprints of our research is available at this website if you want to get any of that. Help yourself, and if you have any questions, I'm glad to answer them. Thanks very much.
It's time for questions for John.
Yep, Lori.
I was wondering if you saw any seasonal differences in use, for example, with Steller's during the breeding season.
You can repeat the question.
Did I see any seasonal differences in use of these areas? I can't answer that question very well because almost all of our work was done during the summer. We did with gray jays. They were interesting in that we tagged a lot of them in the winter, and they basically all shifted away from human use areas on the Olympic Peninsula up into higher elevation. And they're actually a very good indicator of kind of intact old growth area there. So there were some shifts like that. But otherwise, we did radio track the birds throughout the year. And they certainly are still tied into human use areas, but for example, some of the more remote campsites, crows would leave those areas during the winter time, and they would be more closely associated with towns than they were during the summer. But the other species are there all the time. Yeah. Yep.
think about garbage bears or animals that do that, part of the challenge is that they're teaching the young to do that. Do the corvids, it's not birds, are they actually teaching the young, or are they just themselves impacting them, being able to?
So are the birds teaching their young to be bad actors as well, is the question. And, they're certainly modeling behavior, and their young watch them carefully, and the young do similar things that the parents do. I wouldn't say they're teaching them as much as they are demonstrating it. And by having them in that area, their young would presumably do those same sorts of things. We didn't look at that directly, but we have in other cases, and especially with the social birds, the crows primarily, not so much the jays or the ravens, there's strong cultural transmission of knowledge. So I would expect they would easily do it, but the other species probably not so much. Yes?
So I understand this is a recreation conference, but has your work looked at any other spike in corvid activity from other forest users? I'm thinking specifically of fire camps, fire crews. Oftentimes there's a lot of large bunches that are discarded along the fire line. Have you looked at any of that sort of work?
No, we haven't really, but I can guarantee you that any raven in the area of a camp like that's going to be on it for sure. They're going to be able to respond more easily to something like that because they're already in that wildland country. Crows, unless they're by human activity to start with, they're pretty much not going to be there. Stellar's jays, again, they're not going to mount such a quick response as ravens would. So I would think they would be the primary thing. Good question, though. Yep.
Did you have, that campsite photo that had the intensity of use, was there spatial partitioning between the crows and the ravens?
No, not so much. That's an interesting question. Ravens, the activity that was outside of the campground for ravens was just they were further down on, I think that was closer to the nest site of a pair, and that's what you typically have in these areas is you might have one pair or two pairs of ravens using a campsite, but they're very territorial. And crows, on the other hand, really bunch in large numbers with small territories there, so you have many more of them. And I think that's why they're able to basically shrink their home range to fit inside that camp, whereas a raven doesn't. And so we were probably picking up use of the nest site as well there.
All right, need to move on. Help me thank John, everybody.